Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending where you are. My name is Lorenzo Vidino, and I'm the director of the program on extremism at George Washington University. On behalf of the program, let me welcome you to today's event, which is the launch of the report, Planting the Seeds of the Poisonous Tree, Establishing a System of Meaning Through ISIS Education, which is part of our ISIS Files series. Let me give you a bit of a background on the report and the broader project. In 2018, the program on extremism entered into a research partnership with the New York Times to digitize, archive, translate, and publish on an open searchable website the approximately 15,000 pages of internal ISIS documents obtained by Rukmini Kalimaki and her colleagues at the Times during various embeds with the Iraqi army. We embarked on this monumental and ambitious project with the valuable help of the GW Library in the belief that it served two main purposes. One is to study the various aspects of how ISIS worked, from how it fought to how it collected taxes, from its propaganda to how it enforced its own rules on the ground. We therefore partnered with some of the top scholars in the field who have been able to access the document, and some of them have produced reports that we have published or will publish in the coming months. But from the beginning, we wanted this project to have even more practical, tangible, and positive impacts. And in order to do so, we have created partnerships with a broad array of organizations, from some that defend the rights of victims of ISIS in Iraq and Syria, to UNITAD, the United Nations investigative team to promote accountability for crimes committed by ISIS. Our partnership with Hedaya, which culminates today with the launch of this report, serves both purposes. It provides a careful scholarly analysis of ISIS efforts in the educational field, but it also aims to contribute to the development of concrete steps for the re-education of children that had to live under ISIS for years. I cannot think of an organization with more experience than Hedaya to work on such a delicate issue, and we are delighted to have been able to partner with them on this project. Now, before letting the authors of the report speak, we have some opening remarks from representatives of some of the entities that supported the work. We will then have remarks from Hedaya's Executive Director, His Excellency Ahmed Al-Qassimi. So without further ado, let me first introduce His Excellency Herbert Scheibner, who's the President of the European Institute for Counterterrorism and Conflict Prevention. Your Excellency, the floor is yours, please.
Thank you, Lorenzo. Good morning, New York. Good afternoon, Vienna and Madrid, and good evening, Abu Dhabi. First of all, I would like to thank Hedaya for inviting ICTP to participate in this very important project. ICTP is a think tank for counterterrorism and conflict prevention based in Vienna. So therefore, I greet also my team in Vienna and thank especially to our research coordinator, Miriam Hunyadi, for her great contribution to the project. Children are the future of every society. So beautifully, it says in many speeches, mostly nice words, but sometimes only few action. But in a globalized world, crises affect us all, no matter where they take place. However, the spotlights of attention are usually only briefly directed at specific international crises. And now the fight against the pandemic, COVID, masks, many other problems. That is why it is so important right now to look at the future of the children in Iraq and Syria who went to school under the reign of terror of ISIS. Especially at a time of growing radicalism and terrorism, working with children and for children is the best and important prevention of terrorism in the future. It is incomprehensible what teaching methods ISIS has used. The goal of all of us must be to erase these messages of terror and violence from the mind of children and to show them a good path to a new life. Unfortunately, far too little has happened so far in the past. For ICTP, it was particularly important for this project to emphasize the importance for Europe, since many of the children in the camp have European citizenship, but no one wants the children and their mothers back and hardly cares about their education. In some terrible conditions, the children vegetate there without sufficient care, without a school, without a future perspective, but still exposed to the indoctrination of the followers of ISIS. The study now provides a very good insight into how the children were radicalized and also suggests what measures should be taken to de-radicalize them. The world reacts quickly to current terroristic attacks, but acts, to my mind, very slowly when it comes to taking the basis of terror. I very much hope that the international community will take up and develop these proposals, and that Europe will also be aware of its responsibilities. Children are the future of every society. We should give meaning to this sentence. So let us give them the book and the school bag as a tool to prevent others from giving them the rifle and the bomb belt. With our help, these generations of young people will not be the next generation of ISIS, but a generation of a good future in peaceful coexistence in this so long suffering region. Thank you very much, and congratulations to this excellent report.
Thank you, Scheibner. Really appreciate your words. This is very important words, and thank you for contextualizing the problem from a European perspective. The topic is very much debated in Europe, and I think this report will make an impact in Europe in trying to see how things can improve. So really appreciate your words. Let me quickly move to His Excellency Fidel Sendagorta, who is the Political Director for the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and European Union Cooperation of the Government of Spain. Your Excellency, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Greetings to you all. And I have to thank the Hedaya Center and His Excellency Ahmed Al-Qasimi, its Executive Director, and all your team, who has shown a strong commitment and determination throughout the years to combat violent extremism worldwide. I would like to praise its invaluable work of research on education alongside the George Washington University Program of Extremism and the New York Times as part of the so-called ISIS files. This comprehensive study of the files have become one of the most useful tools to design effective counter-narratives to terrorist propaganda. It also proves that when international actors from different fields cooperate on a common goal, we are capable of achieving remarkable results. Unfortunately, terrorism will continue to be one of the most serious threats to international security. ISIS has suffered severe defeats in Iraq and Syria, but the leaders have proved to be smart in making up for their loss of territorial control in the Middle East by opening new and aggressive branches in the Sahel and West Africa. And during the pandemic, jihadists have increased their propaganda and recruiting efforts. They find an excellent breeding ground in thousands of young people which are vulnerable to exposure to radical language in social networks and websites. That is the reason why the collection of those thousands of files abandoned by ISIS and also through your work on education is so important. Thanks to the preservation, digitalization, translation, analysis of those documents, including textbooks used for indoctrination, we are now in a position to better understand the methods of this terrorist organization. Both children and the young are fertile grounds to sow the seeds of radicalization. Enacting counter-narratives activities, as well as public policies against these methods of indoctrination, are critical for the success of all the programs and projects that the European Union is carrying on in Syria to de-radicalize women and children in the camps. Let us just remember that over 40,000 women and children are still in detention in Iraq and Syria. The situation is, of course, a matter of great concern for all governments whose nationals are held in those camps. Spain is also a member of the Strategic Communication Working Group of the Global Coalition to defeat ISIS, which, as you know, also works in this field of activity. Let me finish by emphasizing how proud we are of the Spanish Ministry for Foreign Affairs to support a project of such quality as part of our comprehensive counterterrorism policy. Many thanks again to Hedaya, to George Washington University, and the New York Times for their fruitful efforts. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mrs. Santagorta. Really appreciate your words. This is very important, and again, for contextualizing the problem and the project. And I think the importance of counter narratives, it's something that throughout the project, of course, in this report with Hedaya, but also in other reports, it's something that was always front and center in the work that we've been doing. We need to know what ISIS was saying to then counter its appeal and its message. So thank you again. Let me turn it to His Excellency Ahmed Al-Qasimi, who is the Executive Director of Hedaya. Let me first say thank you again for the opportunity to partner with your organization. It's been a pleasure, and I hope it's not the last opportunity we get to work together. Your Excellency, please.
Thank you, Lorenzo. Distinguished guests, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, I would like to take this opportunity to welcome you to this very important occasion. We are here today to launch Hedaya's analysis and findings derived from the ISIS files, a series of documents obtained following ISIS's expulsion from Mosul, while providing particular insights on ISIS educational curriculum and method of indoctrination. The threat of ISIS ideology continues to expand and to target a new audience. The indoctrination and recruitment of children has now become ISIS's weapon of choice. ISIS's focus on recruiting and indoctrinating children serves a very specific focus: to train children in order to kill and be killed. What we will see today in our report, titled Planting the Seed of the Poisonous Tree, Establishing a System of Meaning Through ISIS Education, is only a glimpse of ISIS's barbarism. Unfortunately, it gets worse. ISIS puts this indoctrination and educational strategy into practice by forcing children themselves to conduct actions of executions and beheadings against those held captive under ISIS rule. The latter part of ISIS indoctrination strategy moves further to continuously expose children to videos of ISIS suicide attacks until the notion of death and destruction becomes a normal and encouraged phenomenon within these children's convictions. When it comes to suicide bombings, the youngest reported suicide attack carried by ISIS was a child who was only 8 years old. In a news interview conducted with an ISIS defector who had first-hand experience with this 8-year-old once said, "It was impossible to convince that 8-year-old against conducting that suicide attack." This, ladies and gentlemen, is how powerful ISIS's indoctrination has become. Therefore, the military defeat of ISIS is simply not enough to counter terrorist ideology. I hope that Hedaya's findings will help shed light and insights on this virtually unexplored topic and assist those in the field to develop robust methods and approaches, as well as effective counter narratives against ISIS ideology. In addition to this report, Hedaya will further develop a series of concrete recommendations for governments, education ministries, and school curriculum developers, administrators and teachers, as well as those involved in rehabilitating and reintegrating foreign terrorist fighters in order to develop effective tools. Finally, I would like to thank George Washington University program on extremism, as well as the European Institute for Counter-Terror and Conflict Prevention and the Government of Spain Ministry of Foreign Affairs for all their support, contributions, and for entrusting Hedaya's expertise on this very important topic. I am proud to say that the documents and the report are now live in the public domain. Thank you.
Thank you, Your Excellency, and that's exactly what I wanted to say. But you now the report is available. We're covering, of course, the event on Twitter. You'll find the link. It's on our website. So I think it'll be very interesting for people to now read the findings of this very very long, and I think it's one of it tells you about the quality of the report, the meticulous approach that was used by the researchers. So again, thank you again for the opportunity to work with Hidayah. So let me finally turn it to my colleague, POE Director of Strategic Initiatives, Deborah Margolin, who has played a key role in all the aspects of the development of this report, and she will moderate the second part of today's event, which is a discussion on the actual report. So Dev, please, floor is yours.
Thank you. I will invite Sarah, Lila, and Frangiz to please join me on stage, as it were. And I'd like to welcome our 3 out of our 4 authors here today, and we're extremely grateful to begin to talk about this report. As we said, it is online, but if you want a physical copy, I highly recommend printing it out as well. It is a really, really great report. We've also put several documents online as well, so that people can kind of see a bit about the methodology and really the primary sources that were used in this project. And so, but without further ado, I'm actually going to hand over to the authors and allow them to speak. But very quickly, I'd like to introduce Sarah Zeiger, Program Manager, Research Analyst at Hidayah, Frangiz Atamurandov, Research Associate and Research Analyst at Hidayah, and Lila El Said, Program Associate, Dialogue Communications at Hidayah. And unable to join us today is Muna Chung, who is a journalist who focuses on violent extremism and also an ISIS Files Fellow who's been working with us at the Program on Extremism for almost 2 years now. So I will hand it over to the authors. They have a few slides that they will share in order to talk about the findings of their paper. A small little housekeeping thing. We have a question and answer section at the bottom. I highly encourage everybody to put questions in as we go. After, we'll have a few minutes to ask some of these amazing questions to our authors so they can provide some insights. So please use the function at the bottom and we will address your questions. Thank you. Andrew, may we please share the slides?
Great. Well, thank you very much, Deborah, for the kind introduction, and good morning, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you all for joining us for the launch of this very important report. I would like to also thank my co-authors, Sarah Zeiger, Laila Sayed, and of course, Mona Chung, who unfortunately was unable to join, however, has contributed greatly to this report. Next slide, please. So the project background was already extensively discussed in the opening remarks, so I'm not going to go too much into that. So next slide, please. However, I would like to thank our partners at the European Institute for Counterterrorism and Conflict Prevention, as well as thank the government of Spain for their generous sponsorship of this project. Next slide, please. So jumping into the actual project, in partnership with GW Program on Extremism, Hidayah transcribed, translated, and analyzed 29 textbooks and 40 additional files. And as part of those additional files, there were some homework assignments, letter and administrative documents, as well as exam rules and test scores. So in total, all of these documents mostly were in Arabic language. However, there were 4 documents that were in English. So the documents were collected between 2016 and 2017 in Ninwa province in Iraq, from a school, an orphanage, and a home of an ISIS fighter. And the material that was collected actually dated between 2014 and 2016. Next slide, please. So the main research questions used to analyze these materials were, so what are the main narratives, values, and themes existing in ISIS textbooks that are aimed at children, and what are the mechanisms utilized by ISIS to educate and indoctrinate children. Next slide, please. So speaking a little bit more about our methodology, so using the critical discourse analysis, we evaluated the social and historical context of the materials, systematically coded the data, then we deconstructed the mechanism and discursive statement utilized by the text or patterns that are in the images of the text. And we also identified cultural references and themes, finally analyzed the results as a holistic picture. Next slide, please. So to establish a contextual background, it's fine. To establish a contextual background of the files, we looked into education in Iraq pre-ISIS, life under ISIS in Iraq, as well as the ISIS education system. Next slide, please. So starting off with education in Iraq pre-ISIS, according to data dated to 2012, showed that access to education between girls and boys was actually relatively equal, with 53% of boys and 45% of girls actually graduating from secondary school. The current curriculum was actually instated in 2003, which is basically post-Saddam era, with the help from and support from the international community, such as the UNESCO. Actually, as per Iraq's constitution, it was a guaranteed right of an individual to receive education in their mother tongue, hence why textbooks and schooling was available in Turkish, Arabic, and Kurdish. Education in Iraq was free of charge, and the way it was split up is in the following way. So the first 6 years of primary mandatory education, after which in the 7th year of school, children were segregated. And in the last 3 years of their high school, children were split into either going through the vocational training or receiving general education. Next slide, please. So now looking into life under ISIS, reports from defectors suggested that expectations that were set out by ISIS were not met, and ISIS government actually failed at providing basic services to its citizens. Unemployment as well as taxes and fees rose, and furthermore, prices on basic goods also increased, with prices on gas, for instance, increased by 8 times in specifically in Mosul. At least this is where the data is coming from. It increased by 8 times, and forcing a lot of people to switch to wood as a main source of energy. Women were subjected to strict laws, which were regulated and imposed by Al-Hisba, which is basically the morality police. And when looking into the life of girls, for instance, under ISIS control, so of course, one of the main aspects was that girls were forced to get married at a young age. But of course, there's a lot of reports and other findings that cover this part. Looking into the medical sphere, so medical staff was already under resourced before ISIS. However, under the ISIS rule, the situation got exacerbated with the medical facilities left highly understaffed and as well as under-equipped. And finally, looking into the life of children. So of course, they were reported to have gone through a lot of trauma and exposure to violence, whether it was their direct involvement in violence or simply witnessing. Furthermore, some children were also recruited by ISIS to spy on their families, as well as in other capacities, such as like spying on the teachers and so on. Next slide, please. Looking into education under ISIS, so 2,700 schools were cut off from the Ministry of Education in 2014. With the state education actually remaining in place only till fall 2015. Now, starting from fall 2015, ISIS actually made their education mandatory. However, a lot of parents still opted out to not send their children to school, and this was for different reasons. One of the reasons was that the school fees were high, and the other reason being that some parents did not want their children to get indoctrinated. So teachers, of course, received threats of flogging or imprisonment, and in some cases, of course, they also received death threats if they refused to teach the curriculum. However, on the other hand, teachers were also threatened from the central government of losing their jobs in case they did teach for ISIS. However, teachers still found ways to resist and either avoid teaching ISIS curriculum as the way it was given to them, or not teach at all. Now, on the last point as mentioned on the slide, while research shows that not a lot of children actually were exposed to the ISIS curriculum or did not attend schools, it, however, provides us a glimpse of what ISIS was building and envisioning for the future of its caliphate. Next slide, please. So here you can actually see a list of subjects that were approved and taught under ISIS education, noting subjects such as history of Islamic world and geography of Islamic world, which are basically ISIS's version of the normal geography or history classes or subjects that you would receive in normal schools, which actually, next slide please, ended up on the list of canceled subjects, along with subjects such as arts, music, psychology, literature, and of course, Christian religious education. And the reason why they canceled the subject was because they were viewed to go against what ISIS propagated worldview and understanding. Next slide, please. So as we analyzed these materials, we saw the use of applying what Aurora Ingram calls a competitive system of meaning as a basic framework of understanding, which helps explain how meanings were internalized and used to create new realities and perceptions for those following, in this case, ISIS. So of course, ISIS leveraged education to instill norms and values and meaning in children who, of course, acted as essentially blank slates that could easily fall under influence and could easily be affected by this ideology. Now, it is important to highlight that each component of these meanings are not necessarily or inherently dangerous on its own, but in a holistic composition, they can be used to create identities, dehumanize the other, and justify the use of violence. So this is it from my side, and I will hand over now to my colleague Laila, who will start off with covering some of the preliminary findings from our materials. Thank you very much.
So thank you so much, Farangiz, and good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, and assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, everybody. Can you please go to the next slide, please? I'm going, to discuss the 3 out of 5 themes that we have covered through this analysis and comprehensive report. Next slide, please. As you see from this graph for the ISIS narratives, so when conducting the quantitative data analysis QDA, the percentage of ISIS narratives of the 5 themes, as you see, was 53% for emphasis on Islam, 17% to governing the so-called Islamic State, 15% fighting enemies with violence, 9% for enemies of ISIS, and 7% for doctrine and creed. Next slide, please. So emphasis on Islam. So the QDA graph shows that the lion's share for ISIS narratives goes to emphasis on Islam, comprising almost 53% of the overall ISIS narratives from the data set. The use and reference of the Islamic symbols, leaders, and practices are centered on how ISIS frames its own identity. Also, God, the term and the word God, and also the names of God was the most frequent word mentioned in all of ISIS textbooks and background documents in this data set. It's clear that for ISIS, only God is worthy of worship. This was highly reflected in ISIS educational curricula and textbooks, not only in the Islamic textbooks, but also in the non-Islamic ones. In the textbooks, there was a significant reference to Quran, Hadith, and pillars of Islamic practice, such as prayer, zakah, fasting, and Hajj. And compared to previous studies of ISIS propaganda, the emphasis on Islam has a heavier focus in education texts. Linking to ISIS' competitive system of meaning, as mentioned earlier by Ferengis, the extensive reference to religious text is used in creating a sense of identity for an in-group to identify to it. ISIS uses a propaganda technique of transfer, where ISIS brands its narrative with the spiritual relevance of Islamic symbols in order to attempt to give itself credibility. The use of the transfer technique increases the potential attractiveness to ISIS brand and narratives. Next slide, please. This quote you see right now explicitly states ISIS' vision and was mentioned in every general introduction to the 29 textbooks from the dataset. ISIS stated its vision that the textbooks were developed according to a clear vision that's not an Eastern or Western one, but Quranic and prophetic vision. The traditional sources of Islam, Quran and Hadith, are critical to the development of ISIS educational curricula. Next slide, please. These two images illustrate the narratives of the 5 pillars of Islam are woven throughout the textbooks, and these pillars reveal the Islamic values are critical to the ISIS way of life. In the first image to your left, it's a lesson on how to pray from the computer programming book, Introduction to Programming Using Scratch, where the exercise is used to teach students how to pray using a Scratch program. Notice the lesson requires students to program the praying individual to correctly perform the opening takbir with appropriate prayer motions. In the second image to your right, what did Ali do on Friday? And this, from a lesson from an English textbook, uses a fictional character of Ali to model the behavior of being a good Muslim through what he does on a Friday day. Notice here also the mention of Friday sermon, prayer, and recitation of the Quran. Next slide, please. This is the second theme, which is governing the so-called Islamic State. This theme is the second theme, and it comprises almost 17% of the overall ISIS narratives from the data set. ISIS uses its textbooks such as History of the Islamic World, Biography of the Prophet, and ISIS Arabic literature to lay the foundations for a governing structure for their so-called state. ISIS political claim is their ummah of true believers is led by the Caliph al-Baghdadi and manifested throughout the caliphate as a physical state. This also includes their claims to land territory and also the physical resources, references to hijra or migration to ISIS-controlled territory, expectations of citizens of the so-called Islamic State as pious, happy, caring towards each other, and dedicated to protecting the caliphate. Also, loyalty to the so-called Islamic State throughout the use of symbols like the ISIS flag that helps in developing a sense of pride or nationalism for their citizens. Next slide, please. Hijra, the second component of ISIS narratives around state building. The objectives for Hijra to ISIS-controlled territory from a 4th grade history book, as you see, is to build a state and nation that protects its followers from physical, emotional, and spiritual threats, and also establishes a base where its armies can launch future missions to spread Islam. In this case, ISIS uses religious symbolism to instill a sense of identity belonging to the so-called Islamic State, a refuge for all Muslims around the world. Two key components from this quote is Hijra provides a way for ISIS to spread Islam on earth, and here is the link to Dawah, or the call and spread of Islam. The second is gathering mujahideen or fighters and preparing armies suggests that this is to be done violently and through jihad struggle. Next slide, please. This is a map of the Islamic words from Geography of the Islamic World for the second intermediate grade. This map is a clear evidence of how ISIS polarizes the Islamic world in contrast to the rest of the world. Again, the us versus them. The white color actually defines the countries where there is an increased number of Muslims. And basically, like this underlines ISIS hypocrisy as majority of the attacks are conducted in these countries where most of ISIS supporters live. The black colors are for the countries where there are an increased number of kuffar or infidels are lurking around. Also, this is used to justify more violence against the rest of the world. Next slide, please. The symbolism of ISIS flag. ISIS, through its flag, attempts to build a sense of loyalty to the state through use of ISIS flag to develop a sense of pride and nationalism for their citizens. As you see from the top left corner, the teacher is pointing to the flag. Next slide, please. The third theme, doctrine and creed. The third component of identity formation is related to ISIS' concept of monotheism. So for this theme, it comprised almost 7% of the overall narratives from the data set. Humans in general have tendency to identify to a social group, and this quote highlights this. We can see also there is a reflection in the in-group and out-group. Creating an in-group where the people below, like you, lean towards favoritism to the members of the in-group, while dehumanize and deintegrate the members of the out-group. Next slide, please. This quote is from an Introduction to Muslim Creed textbook. And in this quote, ISIS states that in a time when our nation or ummah is suffering from conflicts where our enemies wiping off our identity and targeting our creed, separating us from our sources of strength or monotheism, that's the core of our identity. So monotheism is the core of our identity and the tent of God in us. They are using the word tent, and that's based on the Quranic verse number 138 from Surah Al-Baqarah. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Sabghatullahi wa man ahsana min Allahi sabgha wa nahnu lahu abidun. And say ours is the religion of Allah, and who is better than Allah in ordaining religion, and we are worshippers of Him. This slide provides ISIS interpretation of the Islamic doctrine and creed as a critical component to its competitive system of meaning, particularly the interpretation of Tawheed or monotheism, to construct its own identity in relationship to the other and distinguish itself as the only manifestation of Islam. Clearly, ISIS polarizes the discourse, drawing the line between us, the monotheists, and all the others, the enemies. Next slide, please. This is a cover for English for the Islamic State, Book 1. And ISIS takes its extreme interpretation of Tawheed or monotheism as a reaction to concepts and groups that it opposes, linking Tawheed to its survival, where war is not only warranted, but required against its enemies. Thank you so much. And now handing it to my colleague, Sarah Zeiger.
Thank you very much to both Farngiz and Laila for their insights so far. And also I want a special thank you to Muna, who was not able to join us as a co-author on this report. So you can go ahead and go to the next slide. Now that we've seen the first three themes that Laila described, which focus on constructing the in-group narrative in ISIS' sense of identity, I now want to turn to the way in which ISIS constructs their out-group narrative and their call to action, which includes violence. These are two critical components of that competitive system of meaning that ISIS is trying to establish. So this theme is about how ISIS describes its various enemies, which constitutes approximately 9% of the ISIS narrative in the textbooks. ISIS uses words associated with a couple of different concepts. So for example, polytheism or shirk, disbelief, such as kafir, kufar, hypocrisy, so munafiq, apostasy, murtad, murtadin. And they also refer to Shia as rejectionists, so rafidi, rawafid, and derogatory language towards Christians and Jews, as well as references to specific countries in the West and in the East, such as the US and Iran. So the use of this language is intended to distinguish themselves from all the other groups that they do not consider to be part of their so-called Islamic State. Next slide, please. So when ISIS refers to its enemies, it also uses polarizing language that dehumanizes them. So the example on the slide here that's in bold, you see that polytheists are to be treated with animosity and hated. ISIS also claims that their enemies are actively attacking them. We saw an example earlier from the Doctrine and Creed slide, but as another example, in the geography of the Islamic world textbook, the control of oil trade is characterized, and I quote, as a Crusader, Jewish, and Rafidite competition to eradicate Islam and to simultaneously control the wealth of Muslims. Next slide. The second example of this theme here you see is from a computer programming textbook in an exercise called Hunting the Apostates Challenge. This computer programming exercise suggests that the apostates are the enemies and that they should be dealt with violently. So this is a good transition for a representation of both the characterization of the enemy and to the next theme, which is ISIS's suggested response. Next slide. The last theme is with respect to ISIS's call to action, what to do about the enemy, which is to fight violently against them. Up until this point, we have mentioned how ISIS has dehumanized the enemy and created a situation in which it seems like the enemy is attacking their core values. And so using that logic, ISIS claims that violence against its enemies is not only justified, but required. And this theme makes up approximately 15% of the ISIS narrative in the textbooks. So ISIS refers to violence in a few ways. First, through the promotion of violent jihad. And to note that we're not taking this out of context here. It's always mentioned in the context of war and fighting the enemy. It is not mentioned in the sense of an internal or spiritual battle. There are many exercises and lessons in the textbooks where weapons are mentioned. History and literature also include graphic descriptions of events and present Islamic history only through the lens of war. There's also normalization of violence by incorporating images of weapons seemingly randomly throughout, as we'll see in the following slides. Next slide, please. So this is an example from a literature textbook. This poem describes the battlefield, mentioning how the heads of the enemies were put up on spears and that the flesh of the foes were used to make raptors. And this textbook itself mainly contained violent examples of literature, so war stories, stories of martyrs, and even a eulogy celebrating death. Next slide. And I know the images are a bit small, but you can see here some examples of the more passive way in which ISIS refers to violence. So in the bottom left corner on the left-hand side of the page, there's an image of a gun. You see all the words used here, such as army, bullet, sniper, martyr, etc., etc. Next slide. And then these are some examples of guns that were randomly on the pages of an Arabic grammar textbook that are not affiliated with any of the exercises on the same page. These are only 4 of them, but they existed quite frequently in that particular textbook. And I think all of this speaks to the culture that ISIS was trying to create, one where violence was normalized and a normal part of life. Next slide. So now that we've sort of seen the 5 themes that we identified as part of this competitive system of meaning, we just wanted to mention some additional observations that we felt could be turned into more comprehensive research projects that fell outside of the scope of this current project. So first of all, we noticed that when it came to the representations of men, women, boys, and girls in the textbook, the gender was highly stereotyped. If women appeared at all in images, which is very rare, they were fully covered, and most of the images were of men and boys. Women were also usually referenced in their passive roles, so such as wife, mother, nurse, in the kitchen. The exception was when there were references to female fighters, so mujahida. But we do feel like there should be a more comprehensive study of the gender depictions in the textbooks, and that could be a further area of research. We also noticed a pattern related to how ISIS encouraged the concept of brotherhood and made references to how Muslims should treat each other. But the precise way in which this was carried out in the textbooks needs some further explanation and exploration. And finally, one thing we also noticed that in many images, the eyes of people and sometimes animals were blurred out. And likely this is with reference to a hadith, one that is sometimes considered weak, that says the angels do not enter a house in which there is a picture, a dog, or one who is defiled. And this is very interesting in contrast with the other propaganda, for example, online, where people's faces and eyes are in full view. So there's a difference in how they're transmitting their message to the external versus the internal. Next slide, please. So now I want to move to some recommendations that we have with respect to the application of this research in a more practical way. So as Ahmed mentioned in the beginning, we're in the process of drafting a shorter recommendations document that should be released in the coming months. And in the meantime, we need to look at the current situation. So ISIS has been militarily defeated, but not eliminated. We saw twin suicide bombings just last month in Baghdad that were claimed by ISIS, suggesting that there are still cells operating there. There are also significant challenges to rebuilding the infrastructure and education system, both in Iraq and Syria, and thousands of children still stranded in camps such as Al-Hol, where radicalization may still be occurring. And finally, there are cases of children that have been repatriated as foreign fighters to the home countries. So what can we possibly do about all of that? So on our side, we recommend for governments, we encourage transnational cooperation to develop and implement programs in handling cases of children exposed to ISIS narratives, including sharing good practices and lessons learned with each other. We think it's important to determine which children may have been exposed to ISIS's competitive system of meeting, as we mentioned here, and the extent to which those narratives have been internalized in order to assess the risk that those children may pose to themselves or others. But we also recommend avoiding using terms like extremism or terrorism to label individuals and activities related to education, youth, and children to avoid stigmatization and making sure that we're taking a child-centered approach. Still, we think it's important to generate public awareness on the topic, including providing forums for public debate regarding potential concerns of the community addressing these issues. Next slide, please. For education ministries and curriculum developers, we suggest to consider working with psychologists to design and implement education programs and to avoid separating children from their fundamental reality and identity that they've been exposed to in the ISIS narrative. In some cases, this is all that children know, and we can't just take away everything and expect them to be okay. There needs to be an appropriate process. We also think that it's important to embed proactive narratives in the educational curriculum in general to help children rebuild the sense of identity and purpose that is multifaceted, that is not polarized Black versus white and us versus them. So we think it's important to dismantle the us versus them narratives by providing experiences and exposure to individuals with identities that are different than them. And finally, developing programs that build resilient and tolerant students through interactions, games, and play, especially since many students did not receive any education at all under ISIS. Next slide. For administrators and teachers, we recommend to train teachers on mechanisms and narratives used by ISIS, such as what we found in these educational textbooks, as well as methods to prevent further radicalization and to counter those messages and narratives used by ISIS. We think it's important to work with teachers to reverse the process of normalizing violence, as we saw in the last couple of slides, by creating a safe space in the classroom. And we think it's important for all of us to include the formal and informal religious teachers in this training, especially in those areas once occupied by ISIS, for example, in Iraq, but more broadly to incorporate the religious education into the fold. And we also think it's important to review existing coursework on religion in particular and provide teachers with tools and skills on how to teach about different religions. And this is in order to not polarize further this worldview that ISIS is trying to transmit. Next slide. All in all, we think it's important for rehabilitation and reintegration to maintain a client-centered approach and apply the do no harm principle, and also take advantage of a multifaceted pool of experts to inform the appropriate rehabilitation and reintegration for children, and that this should include social, psychological, emotional, and spiritual and religious rehabilitation that also incorporates interventions for children that address trauma that they may have faced on the ground. And finally, ensuring that the rehabilitation and reintegration of the entire family is conducted simultaneously and cohesively. So that's all we have in terms of presentation today. I hope that we've provided you with an overview of the values and narratives that ISIS was trying to portray through its textbooks and education system. And I also hope that you do take the time to go through the research report. I know it's long, but it's very comprehensive, and it is full of many more examples of this complex competitive system of meaning that ISIS is attempting to create. So that being said, I want to thank you again to all my co-authors, two of which are on the call today, also the translators that were involved in this project, and the reviewers from GW, from EICTP, Hidayah, and also thank you to the government of Spain for their sponsorship. This has been a very rewarding project, a lot of work, and I'm very proud of what we've achieved. So I now hand the floor back over to Devora for any questions or discussion points you may have.
Thank you. That was such a comprehensive description and overview of the research. I've had the pleasure of reading this, but some of our audience hasn't. And so some of the questions actually delve into a bit about your research methodology. And so I'd like to kind of ask you guys to explain a little bit more about your critical discourse analysis and that process so people can understand where the 5 themes came from.
I can go ahead and take that question. So I think you saw the sort of critical discourse analysis at the beginning, and I would caveat to say that it's a little bit of a pseudo critical discourse analysis, because usually when you're doing a critical discourse analysis of textbooks, you're also interviewing teachers, you're asking about the process that went into the curriculum design, and that's just not really possible in this context. We did consider interviewing some teachers, but they were very difficult to access. And it's also a very sensitive topic for them to discuss. So we thought to just focus on the primary data set that we had in the textbooks. So after we did sort of a contextual analysis of what we knew was going on the ground in terms of education under ISIS, we then coded the documents based on sort of some key themes that we grouped together based on keywords. So we kind of did a keyword analysis and then said, okay, these are the recurring patterns of words. How can we sort of form these main themes out of those? And when we did the final cross-check of coding, we essentially coded by sentence. So for example, if the word prophet and Muhammad came up in the same sentence, as it very frequently does, it's not coded twice, it's just coded as one time, emphasis on Islam. So trying to take into consideration sort of a broader context. And what that essentially did was we don't see the themes as in respect to the broader text, but we do see the sort of the breakdown in terms of percentages as related to the ISIS narrative itself. So this is sort of the message that ISIS wanted to achieve through its educational textbooks. These percentages are representative of that proportionality.
Yeah, I think that's very interesting. As you can see, the in-group versus out-group. The in-group is about 75% of the overall narrative, and the out-group was about 25%. I think that was very fascinating. So one of our questions is, after the analysis of the ISIS files documents, which educational technique is used for indoctrination of ISIS children was exceptional or different? See the author's thinking.
Yeah, that's a good question. I know, Lila, you did a little bit of digging on this in particular. I noticed you were digging into some of the guidance questions that the textbooks had for teachers. Do you want to take that question?
Yes, I'm happy to. So would you mind repeating the question again, Devora, if you don't mind?
I'm on mute. So the question is, what educational technique is used for indoctrination of children by ISIS was exceptional or different? Something that kind of surprised you, that kind of came out of, if you think about traditional education, what was a technique that ISIS used to indoctrinate children?
So when it comes, like to the question, like to the teacher's guidelines, it was basically, like asking the teacher, this is what the student want to take out of this class. This is how they should, like keep creed as, like as core monotheism. So it was, like, I was surprised that the indoctrination started from the teachers. So I'm not, like surprised, for this to, to also to be taken to the students. But one of the, like the very also, like unique things that we have found out, actually, when they are trying to reinforce a certain idea or a certain doctrine, they associate it with other ones that's very acceptable. So, for example, like the Muslim prays a lot, God loves, like a good Muslim or a good neighbor. And then, like, all of a sudden you'll find that, like message about, God loves martyrs and God appreciates mujahid or mujahideen. So, or mujahidat, of course, like the females ones. So if you see, so they are trying, like to infiltrate and put their ideas, and as like planting the poisonous seeds, as the title of the report, into a very acceptable, normal, like sentences and like that can come at any, like second, third, or fourth grade, schoolers or graders. Thank you.
If I may also add to this, actually. So just thinking back to the actual files, I think, and it sort of relates to one of the other questions that were raised on the specifically a comparison to the Nazi education system. But we did see, a similar technique used by ISIS in sort of using their ideology and embedding their ideology in the education. So whether it's geography, and as Laila mentioned, they sort of readapted geography to how they perceive it. So completely canceling out whatever everyone else in the world is basically taught, and giving their own take on it. The other part that I found interesting was how they subtly would embed some of the images into the curriculum. So some of the ones that we already saw today in the presentation was, for instance, for the indoctrination, there was a, where is the flag? And then the flag is actually the ISIS flag. So again, it's like a very subtle way of indoctrinating and putting through their ideology. And then the exposure or to desensitizing people or children to violence through having images of guns, bombs, and grenades, and so on. And this was used in, for instance, English education documents or, subject, where, for alphabets, some of the images that were used to explain an alphabet or a letter were guns or bombs or explosions and so on. So I thought that was also very interesting from my side, at least. Thank you.
Yeah, the desensitization of violence is one of the main factors that you discussed. We actually have two questions I'm going to combine into one. We have Daniel Wegland, who's asking about, despite the fact that ISIS was only a governing entity for a short period of time, what were the indicators that this indoctrination had lasting influence? And we also have a question from Asul Ahmed, who asks about ISIS exporting this ideology to other education systems or other contexts. And specifically, is there any indication of the extent that foreign terrorist fighter children were exposed to this ideology?
Well, I suggest on the first question, I think, Farangis, I don't know if you can everyone hear me? Because I think my internet connection is not very great.
We can hear you.
Yes. Okay, so I think there's also a question of how it relates to the Nazi education system. So maybe you can take that question. And then I maybe can take the second question with respect to exporting to other contexts. Yeah, so I mean, I sort of touched upon this in my first answer that, when we looked into the Nazi education system, we looked more into the comparison of how they used or leveraged education to embed their indoctrination and their ideology in education. However, unfortunately, we cannot really tell, how these children, how long the lasting effects of such indoctrination will be on children. A, B, the other thing being that, as we said, some of the findings showed that not a lot of children were exposed to this curriculum. However, it's still very important for us to analyze it and to see what ISIS had in mind of, to instill these ideas in children. And this is something that was actually, this curriculum was available on CD-ROMs. So, anyone could have access to them, and then they would have to just print it out, and then they could read through it. So it's a little bit difficult for us to tell exactly how many children were actually exposed to it. And, I also doubt that people would, or children would, or their families would actually admit to their children being exposed to it.
And then on my side, just to add to that, I think that the findings of this report are not necessarily a surprise in terms of the competitive system of meaning that ISIS is trying to create. So these are the same themes that show up in all of the analysis of previous documents, propaganda that's distributed online, offline. I think what maybe is slightly different is the composition of the documents. And I think more emphasis on the in-group narrative and more emphasis on trying to affiliate their narrative with Islamic concepts and symbols is much stronger in the educational documents than it has been in sort of the propaganda documents that have been circulated online, where there's a less focus, but still a fairly heavy focus on violence. 15% is still quite significant, but less heavy focus on violence in the educational documents and a more focus on building that identity. And I think that just speaks to the nature of the education system, and what ISIS was trying to create through their education system is they really were trying to build that sense of identity in their next generation, and build an identity of that affiliation with the state, with all the symbols of statehood. And in the end, they didn't succeed because their education system was dismantled when they were defeated. But I still think it speaks to their future vision, and we shouldn't take that lightly, because if ISIS is able to gain strongholds again, or to gain strongholds online, virtually, these are the sorts of risks that we're facing.
We have a question from Gina Vale, who says, in my own research, I found educational pamphlets designed for parents, especially mothers. My question just disappeared. Sorry. Andrew, you hit yes too quickly. There we go. Sorry. Especially mothers, to indoctrinate their children. Did you find any documents designed for private or informal education? If so, how did these narratives compare to formal textbooks or materials?
So I think what I already also mentioned, and again in my previous answer, about the curriculum actually being available on CDs. So there was no evidence to support this, at least, but in my understanding, and I would think that it would easily be available for someone to print out and to actually teach their children at home, especially as Lila also highlighted during her session. There were actually instructions for teachers. So there was no reason why, similarly, these mothers or whoever was teaching these children couldn't have done so in private.
Excellent, thank you. I have my own question. So I, obviously got to see the documents and read this paper and talk to you all about this process and your thought process. But I wanted to know, of the files you had access to, what do you think provided the most insight into kind of the ISIS indoctrination system and their system of meaning? And that answer might be different for each of you, so feel free to all take a stab at that.
On my side, I think the document that stood out to me the most was the geography of the Islamic world, because it really, I think it showed the polarization. You saw the map, but throughout it really emphasized this us versus them, this sort of disagreement between the so-called Islamic world and the rest of the world, and polarized, characterized the enemy as attacking the in-group that was, they said were the they were under attack as Muslims. And so just this narrative was really strong throughout that particular textbook. And that a little bit surprised me because, you know, how could someone take geography and turn it into a radicalization book, but they did. So that was the one that was the strongest for me.
I can go next. So I think for me, there were a couple of things that stood out. One of them was, and you will find this, of course, in the report. I don't think it was actually highlighted today in the presentation. But the image that was used as a cover for the geography book, I believe, and it was basically an ISIS fighter standing in in the woods, and you could see that he had, you know, a rifle, but you could only see his back. And I thought that was very interesting how, again, as Sarah said, you know, in the subjects such as geography, they still managed to sort of add their element into it. And the other thing, and I myself, you know, I grew up in the UAE and I went to school here, so I actually received Islamic education. And, you know, never did it was bringing back to like, why did I find what interesting in the actual materials, but was the hadith that the selection of the hadith that they actually used in their curriculum, and also the interpretation of those hadiths. So like especially in the instructions that were given to children, while the hadith itself is completely, you know, like peaceful and harmless and so on, but the way they use like the instructions that were given to teachers and the interpretation they gave of it made like completely put it in a different view. And it wasn't specifically on violence, but it was even looking into, you know, gender and sort of demeaning women and so on. So that was also something that I found interesting.
Leila, do you have any that you'd like to
So for me was, you know, like the biography of the Prophet, the way, you know, like, because, you know, like as Farangis, I grew up in Cairo, and, you know, like I also, you know, like received the Islamic education, and the way they had reduced all what we have been taught about the Prophet, his perseverance, his prophethood, you know, all these beautiful, you know, like lessons that we learned about him growing up. It was all reduced to violence, to battles, to, you know, like to fighting. And also another one when it comes to the history book, or, you know, like their own version of history. Again, you know, like that beautiful history was reduced to only, you know, justifying that, you know, compared the Medinan, or like when the Prophet migrated to Medina, and like the status and how, you know, like the Islam was spread and the expansion of the Islamic nation and so on and so forth was only, you know, like for legalizing jihad. So everything is being, you know, like quote in a different, you know, like in a way that just leads to violence and justification of this violence, which is, you know, like very offensive, you know, like for Muslims, by the way, you know, like, because this is not how it should be, you know, like this is not how we were taught, this is not how we grew up, you know, like learning about, but, you know, that's, you know, like, that's it for me. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm going to ask one final question because I'm cognizant of the time. But this question asks about, and I don't know if we actually have the answer, but I think it's an interesting thing to talk about as we look at the files, is were you able to identify the timing needed by ISIS to develop such materials? And I think about, you know, the science textbook focusing on the tectonic plates and religion kind of being added in on top of everything. But I wonder if you guys had any discussions about, you know, the development of these materials in the timeline. I think we lost Sarah. Farangis, did you want to address that?
Well, at least from my experience, I don't think we really had any insight on how long it took them to develop this curriculum. But Sarah, Lila, if you have more insights into that, please do share.
Well, the curriculum was, so saved by the bell, I managed to get my internet back and working. The curriculum was not immediately implemented. So there was a time gap between 2014 when, you know, ISIS started to take control of some of these areas. And then when the curriculum became permanent in 2015 or mandatory in 2015. So I would guess that it was around a year. And I do know that they tried to use the University of Mosul and asked certain individuals to create this curriculum for them. I do also know that there was some pushback based on some open source documents. So roughly, you know, they had to use the old Iraqi curriculum for a year before they were really able to take these documents and use them in what they tried to create of classrooms.
Thank you. I'd like to invite all of our speakers kind of back onto the stage, so to speak, as we invite Ivo Vinkamp to offer some closing remarks, the Deputy Executive Director of Hidayah, to offer some closing remarks on the launch of today's report and today's event. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Deborah. Your Excellencies, colleagues, distinguished participants. I think the launch and the presentations and discussions that were part of that actually have shown that the opportunity that we were given to actually have access to primary sources of ISIL, of Daesh, and to analyze them has given us a very important and relevant opportunity to get a better and even more practical understanding of how exactly ISIL were trying to plant the seeds of their destructive ideology in the minds of children and young people. And the several things that were presented today are showcasing how they try to do that in a very comprehensive, systematic, subtle, and of course, at the end of the day, destructive way. And I think it was also mentioned that maybe the main concepts that became clear, the main elements of the ideology that they are trying to put into the minds of these young people are not new as such, but it gave more in-depth practical insights on how they were actually doing that. With some new elements also added to our understanding of what they were focusing on specifically when it comes to their educational efforts. And I think these insights also have given us the opportunity to actually, as we will do, translate that also into practical suggestions, recommendations for not only policymakers, but I think equally important, of course, for those people who are working directly with the young children that we are talking about. For those who are returning, but let's not forget also for those children and young people who are still in the region and also still deserve our attention and support to actually deal with what they have been gone through. Based on that understanding, one of the things that I do want to highlight is that, of course, it gives us an opportunity to do something positive with what, at the end of the day, of course, is a horrible story in itself. And it can be used, as was mentioned, for educational purposes, for efforts related to rehabilitation, reintegration, I presume even for communication efforts. But I think that the core element, or at least one core element of that, looking at children and young people, that of course, it should be done with respect to them. And that respect can now even be translated in a more practical sense in terms of trying to understand what they've been gone through, how to use that in a way that I think will not end up in trying to force them to simply replace the identity that maybe they've built under the ideological educational system and the indoctrination of ISIL, not to simply force them to replace that with a new one, because it's part of their identity maybe now or how they were educated, but to find ways, I think as was mentioned in the presentation, to find suitable ways, respectful ways, to support them to build a sense of identity and purpose that is multifaceted. And of course, to also do that where needed, addressing the effects of trauma that they might also have suffered under the ideological indoctrination of ISIL through their education system. And with that, I want to actually keep it also short from my side. But of course, we cannot close without one more time thanking our wonderful colleagues and partners from the Program on Extremism, from the European Institute for Counterterrorism and Conflict Prevention. Also, one more time thanking our generous donor, the government of Spain. And please allow me to, last but not least, I really also want to thank the core team of Hedaya. And I think you were privileged to actually meet with them in this meeting, Sarah, Laila, and Farangis. You were a brilliant team and you've done an excellent job. So congratulations. We are very proud of you. And with that, I want to conclude with your permission this launch meeting. Please stay safe. Normally in the past, I would say safe travels, but that seems something from a very long time ago. Let's hope soon we will be actually connected and we can meet again. For the time being, please stay safe, stay connected, and thank you all very much. Please.
And thank you to all of our speakers, everyone who joined us here today. Please, please, please do check out isisfiles.gwu.edu to see the files themselves, as well as other files, and read the full and download the full report. And thank you again to everyone, and specifically our authors. You did an excellent job conveying a very complex idea, and we look forward to hearing these policy recommendations in the future. So thank you for joining us.
Thank you.